Hello, everybody. Welcome to another interview session with me, Maya Tousi, and we have a special guest. We have Joseph Robertson, the director of Orthodox Conservatives. And welcome to the show, Joseph. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. Yeah, a bit cold today, but
Yeah,
fine.
exactly. Very, very patriotic background, by the way. Um,
Oh, thanks. We
and
try.
there is, speaking of being patriotic, we have to care about what's going on in the country, and there is a problem that it doesn't just apply to the country, but also the rest of the so-called globe. And this is about what happened in 2020 and onwards, basically, since the first lockdown and everything that's been happening before, prior to the COVID days and everything else there, in terms of what the government actually did to be able to push the messaging. So, what's the latest finding that you basically discovered?
Well, we're looking at the way the government's still being pressured to use behavioural tactics, psychological tactics, to implement different draconian ideas. As we've seen over the last couple of years, this was called conspiracy theory. This was called, basically people were trying to gaslight people and
Yeah.
thinking that they weren't being controlled or manipulated. And now what we're seeing is that this was a very high level psychological exercise, which is
Hmm.
still continuing now in the new guise of the climate emergency. Now that we've finished currently, or temporarily at least, with pandemic exercises, we've now moved on to the latest mass hysteria, which is climate change. And what we're seeing is a concerted effort, especially in this country, but across the globe, from governments to sort of change the way they look at how they evaluate people's behaviors and now to focus more on what they can do to create an atmosphere of alarm where people will listen to government messaging and try to reduce their so-called emissions behaviors.
Interesting, because a while after the first lockdown, the government using the media, essentially they did a bit of a confession, or they self leaked saying, yeah, we did use behavioral scientists. I always kind of questioned that because I thought, well, this isn't something that you guys should be openly proud of. So do you think that was basically controlled leak? That was controlled confession saying, see, we're kind of open about it, but we're not going to show you everything.
Well, there's it's funny you should say that. There's a report called Mindspace which came out in, I think it's in 2019, and this was essentially a high level advisory report coming from the governmental advisory board at the time, they were saying that we need to start using behavioral psychology to address the way people's diet habits, the way their travel habits,
Mhm.
etc., are formed, that it's fine to do that because
Right.
ultimately the government should be in control of what's moral and what's best for the people. Which is scary language if you've ever lived in somewhere like North Korea or Russia, for instance.
Or
But
New
when
Zealand
it
these
comes
days.
at home, or New Zealand now, but without historical examples, it's easy to just dismiss that
Mm.
kind of language as something that's best for the people. But this is four legs good, two legs better kind of territory we're getting into now. The House of Lords have just released a report in October talking about why the climate alarm and the climate emergency is now in our hands, to quote their title.
Wow.
Whose hands would be my question, because it's certainly not ours.
No.
Um, but this is more of the same now. They're talking about changing people's diet, changing people's travel behaviors, changing people's attitudes to the way that they move around their own country, not just
And
abroad.
climate lockdowns as well, right? In Oxfordshire.
Right. Well, this is happening already, and again, I hasten to stress this fact because most people will come back and say, no, no, it's just a travel restriction. These aren't just travel
Yeah.
restrictions. These are looking at the way people live. You are going to be fined for moving around in a car. And if you've invested a lot of time and money into your car over the last few years, and you're now dealing with the cost of living crisis,
Yeah.
this is another massive kick in the teeth. And it comes from the top down, you know.
Yeah, but that's the main question, I guess, because most of these issues that we talk about, and on social media, and on GB News and all the other places, and a lot of people are targeting the politicians, and of course they are responsible. They should be held to account. But it seems to be the actual decisions and the actual implementation and everything else is It's not the government, it's a state. So as in, like, most of the time, regardless of what sort of mainstream political party or politician you have, it's going to happen anyway. Obviously, you hang around Westminster a lot. I don't know why. Like myself. Have you been in all the MPs that you know of and you speak to? Any conversation that you've had that could kind of give you a bit of hope that there are some MPs left that are quite aware and kind of want to fight back, or do we lose hope?
Well, the awareness almost makes me less hopeful, because there are some great MPs and they know what's going on to an extent. And don't get me wrong, some voices now are beginning to speak out about it. You saw, Bridgen the other day talking in Parliament about, vaccine damages. Where's that
Yep.
been for the last couple of years? Christopher Chope. You've got guys like, John Redwood, who's flying the flag on all the climate stuff. But the problem is they're isolated voices. MPs are term politicians. They do not hang around long enough
Yeah.
very often to make real change. And I say that even for the ones who have been there 10, 15, 20 years, it's not long enough to
Yeah.
fight against the system. You're working against a massive machine of bureaucracy.
Permanent machine.
And
Yeah.
a permanent machine, a machine that's instilled itself, into the civil service in such an extraordinarily chokehold kind of fashion.
Yeah.
Is very difficult to change this immediately. You've got, advisors like Susan Mitchie, who's a renowned communist agent, quite openly works for the Communist Party of Great Britain. I mean, you've got people who are in the civil service who are essentially climate lobbyists at this stage. One key thing that a lot of people don't know about is that back in Tony Blair's era, he actually introduced a law surrounding Ofcom where, for instance, the BBC don't actually need to have any debate on climate change. They can accept it as a fact. A lot of people don't know about this law
Wow.
that came in 2001 to 2002. But the reality is that even the major TV stations who work in close collaboration with all the spin doctors who, of course, push the climate change story 24/7, they don't have to challenge the narrative, which is why something like GB News is so special and so different, because they are allowed to challenge that narrative.
It's also
Um,
why they want to break it down. That's why, and there's this pushback
mhm.
essentially against GB News, and so what Tony Blair did was the early days of the same narrative that Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand used a year ago, when she went on TV saying, "You will get your news from us, the government. We will be your source." I'm like, well, that's impressive. That's
The
brave of you.
Ministry for Truth.
And exactly, it's funny because and one of the problems that we have is actually something that we like, which is democracy, but that kind of becomes, it's not our fault, or it's not the fault of democracy that has become a problem. It's because we still have, as we call, the permanent state of the machine, or the actual states, without even using the words deep state. Even the normal state is still difficult to challenge. We can't really use the current mechanism of democracy in terms of the ballot paper and public office to fight back because of short termism. Should we need dictatorial freedom? Is that time?
Well, the thing about the ruse that's being portrayed is that a lot of the facts and figures that really hit home aren't given to the public, and I think if they were,
Yeah.
on a far broader scale, we would see a lot of difference. There is actually at the moment a consensus in this country to have a referendum on net zero. A lot of people don't know that. I mean,
Yeah.
that's in the YouGov polling. Groups like R26 doing a great job have brought that to the fore over the last few
Yeah.
months. And the last year. But also, there are specific numbers that would shock and alarm a lot of people. I'm going to give you a few. So 226 billion. That's how much it's going to cost the taxpayer to get rid of internal combustion engines. How many people know that figure?
Not many.
If we got rid of net zero commitments tomorrow and started to work our way out some of the treaties that we are currently cordoned into, we would be saving the taxpayer 50 billion a year.
Wow.
Which coincidentally is exactly the same figure that Rishi Sunak has been scrambling around for with tax raises. So if you want some proper policy making there, it's not far to go. And I think when people start to realise the scale of how much they've been lied to,
Yeah.
that even if net zero was achieved, it was still only reduce like a fraction of a percentage of global emissions. And that's only a fraction of a percentage of our emissions, and we are only a fraction of global emissions.
Yeah.
So when you start looking at how much cost related to how much you actually get out of it, even if the climate change narrative were true, and there's plenty of science to show that it is not true, even if it were, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, we would not be saving ourselves or the planet.
Now, to be fair, there are other bigger lies that's been going on for longer than net zero, including the international banking system and fiat currency. We're still losing that battle, so that's a whole different argument for a different day. But a massive thank you to Joseph Robertson, the director of Orthodox Conservatives. Check him out. I'll put their social media and everything in the description for you guys. I'm Maya Tousi, and we are the media.